As the plane taxied to the gate, passengers continued to glance at Caitlin with admiration. A few even whispered her name, and she could hear bits of conversation. That's Caitlin Clark. Such a class act. She's not just a great player, she's a great person. When the seatbelt sign turned off, the veteran stood up, adjusting his uniform jacket. He made his way back to Caitlin's row, extending a hand. I didn't get to introduce myself properly. Name's Richard Dawson, U.S. Army, retired. Caitlin shook his hand firmly. It's an honor to meet you, Mr. Dawson. Call me Richard. He chuckled. You remind me of my granddaughter, always looking out for others. As passengers slowly filed out, Richard hesitated. Listen, I don't know if you believe in fate, but this flight, this moment, it means more than you know. I served for 35 years, lost a lot of good men. Sometimes I wonder if people still remember. Today, you reminded me that they do. Caitlin felt a lump in her throat. We always will. As they stepped into the terminal, the media was waiting. Somehow the story had spread, and cameras flashed. A reporter rushed forward. Caitlin, can you tell us why you gave up your seat? She smiled, keeping it simple. Because he deserved it more. The moment went viral. Social media exploded with praise. Dr. Caitlin Clark. Honor the Veterans trended worldwide. Fans shared stories of their own loved ones who served. The airline even announced they would start offering complimentary upgrades to veterans whenever possible. Later, that night, Caitlin scrolled through the messages flooding her phone. But one stood out. It was from Richard's granddaughter. Miss Clark, I just wanted to thank you. My grandpa hasn't talked much about his service in years. But today he called me, full of life, telling me someone finally saw him. You didn't just give up a seat, you gave him something more. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. Caitlin smiled, setting down her phone. One simple act of kindness had created a ripple effect she never expected. And deep down she knew this was a moment she'd never forget. A few days later, Caitlin was back home trying to settle into her routine. But the impact of that flight hadn't faded. Messages kept pouring in from fans, veterans, and even other athletes who were inspired by her gesture. Then her phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. She hesitated before answering. Hello? Miss Clark, this is General William Carter, retired. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. She sat up straight. Not at all, sir. What can I do for you? I just wanted to personally thank you for what you did for Richard Dawson. He's an old friend of mine, and I can't tell you how much that moment meant to him, and to so many of us who served. We often feel forgotten, but you reminded the world that respect and gratitude still matter. Caitlin was speechless. I was just doing what felt right. The general chuckled. That's what makes it special. He paused for a moment before continuing. I'd like to invite you to Washington, D.C. for a special ceremony at the National Veterans Memorial. We'd love to honor you for your kindness and the awareness you've raised. Her heart skipped a beat. Me? I don't think I deserve that. I just gave up a seat. You did much more than that, he said firmly. You reminded millions of people what it means to show appreciation. And trust me, that's worth honoring. A few weeks later, Caitlin found herself standing in front of a crowd at the memorial, surrounded by veterans, officials, and everyday citizens who had been touched by her actions. She felt out of place among these true heroes. But as she looked at Richard, who stood proudly beside her, she realized this wasn't about her. It was about the message. When she stepped up to the podium, she kept her words simple. I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just had an opportunity to show gratitude, and I took it. But the real heroes are the men and women standing here. Today, the ones who have given so much. If my small act reminded people to honor them more, then I'm grateful. Applause filled the air. Cameras flashed. The moment felt surreal. As she stepped down, Richard put a hand on her shoulder. I told you this flight happened for a reason. Caitlin smiled. Maybe he was right. That night, as she lay in her hotel room, scrolling through messages again, she saw a new post from the airline. They announced a new initiative. For every first-class seat purchased, a veteran would be given a complimentary upgrade. Caitlin shook her head in disbelief. She had only intended to give up her seat for one man, but now countless veterans would be honored because of that one small decision. She set down her phone, a warm feeling settling in her chest. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness don't just change one life. They start something bigger. A few months later, Caitlin was back to her usual grind, training, traveling, and competing. But something had changed. Everywhere she went, people stopped her, not just to talk about basketball, but about what she had done for Richard. One day after a game, an older man in a wheelchair approached her at an autograph signing. His veteran's cap sat slightly crooked on his head, his hands trembling as he held out a photo. Caitlin took it carefully and saw a black and white image of a young soldier smiling in uniform. "That was me," he said, his voice soft but proud. "Korea, 1952. She looked back at him, feeling the weight of the moment. "You served our country. Thank you." His eyes welled up. "No, thank you. People like me, we don't expect much. But what you did, it reminded the world we're still here." Caitlin took his hand and squeezed it gently. "You'll always be remembered." As she continued signing autographs, she realized that this one simple decision, giving up her seat, had turned into something much bigger than she could have ever imagined. It wasn't about the viral moment or the recognition. It was about the quiet conversations, the heartfelt thank yous, and the way it had sparked something in people. Then an idea began to form. A few weeks later, Caitlin made an announcement. She was partnering with several organizations to launch Seats for Service, a program dedicated to making travel easier for veterans. Airlines, sports teams, and event organizers joined in, pledging to provide free or upgraded seats to those who had served. The response was overwhelming. People donated miles, businesses signed on, and veterans shared their gratitude. Caitlin couldn't believe how far this had come, from one small moment on a plane to a movement that would help thousands. One day, Richard called her. "You know," he said, his voice full of warmth, "when you gave up your seat, I thought it was just a kind gesture, but now, you've given so many veterans a place to be seen, to be valued. I don't know how to thank you." Caitlin smiled, thinking back to that quiet moment in the airport when she had first noticed him. "You've already thanked me, Richard. Just by being you." And with that, she knew this wasn't just a story about a basketball player giving up her seat. This was about respect, gratitude, and the power of a single act of kindness to change the world. As the Seats for Service initiative took off, Caitlin found herself balancing her career with something much bigger than basketball. Every time she stepped onto the court, she knew she wasn't just playing for her team or her fans. She was playing for something greater. One evening, as she was reviewing some logistics for the program, she received an email from a woman named Sarah Dawson. She immediately recognized the last name. "Dear Caitlin, I wanted to reach out personally. My grandfather, Richard Dawson, has talked about you nonstop since your flight together. He told me that moment changed his life. But I need you to know, it changed mine too. He was never one to talk much about his time in the military. He carried a lot of memories, some painful, some beautiful, but he always kept them to himself. But after meeting you, something shifted. He started sharing stories, he started opening up, he started living again. Sadly, Grandpa passed away last week. But in his final days, he kept telling us how grateful he was for you. Not just for that flight, but for reminding him that his service still mattered. I can't begin to thank you enough for what you did for him." Caitlin swallowed hard, her eyes welling with tears. She sat back, processing the weight of Sarah's words. She had no idea that a simple act of kindness would mean so much. A few weeks later, she was invited to a special memorial service for Richard. She didn't hesitate. She flew out to his hometown where a small but powerful ceremony was being held in his honor. Veterans, family members, and friends gathered to remember him, not just as a soldier but as a man whose life had been reignited in his final years. When it was Caitlin's turn to speak, she took a deep breath. Richard Dawson was a hero, long before I ever met him. He served with honor, lived with dignity, and left a legacy that will never be forgotten. I didn't give up my seat that day for recognition. I did it because he had already given up so much for us. As she stepped down, Sarah hugged her tightly. Thank you for seeing him, she whispered. Later that evening, Caitlin found herself alone at the airport, staring out at the tarmac as the sun set. She thought about Richard, about the countless veterans who had served, about all the stories that deserved to be heard. Her phone buzzed, a notification from Seats for Service. Another veteran had been upgraded to first class. Another small moment of gratitude. Another ripple effect. A few months later, Caitlin was deep in the heart of basketball season, juggling games, media appearances, and community projects. But no matter how busy she got, she always made time to check in on Seats for Service. One day, after a tough practice, she received a message from an airline executive. Caitlin, we have something big in the works and would love for you to be a part of it. Call me when you have a minute. Curious, she dialed the number right away. Caitlin, glad you called. Listen, your program has done something incredible, so many veterans have been honored and we want to take it even further. We're launching a Seats for Service initiative across all major airlines, and we want you to help announce it. She sat up straight. Wait, all major airlines? That's right. Every U.S. airline has agreed to provide complimentary first-class upgrades to active duty military and veterans whenever seats are available. No more hoping for an upgrade. This will be standard policy. Caitlin was speechless. That's amazing. And there's more, the executive continued. We want to name the initiative after Richard Dawson. We heard his story and felt like he embodied exactly what this is about. A lump formed in her throat. Richard would be so honored. A few weeks later, Caitlin stood on a stage in Washington, D.C., surrounded by military officials, airline executives, and veterans. As cameras flashed, the announcement was made. The Richard Dawson Seats for Service initiative would ensure that no veteran or active duty service member would ever have to sit at the back of the plane again. When Caitlin stepped up to speak, she held back tears. Richard Dawson never asked for anything in return for his service. Like so many veterans, he quietly carried the weight of his sacrifices. But now, thanks to this initiative, we can finally give something back. This isn't just about seats, it's about respect, it's about gratitude, and it's about making sure our heroes know they are never forgotten. The crowd erupted in applause. Reporters rushed forward. Social media exploded. That night, Caitlin sat in her hotel room scrolling through the news coverage. She thought about Richard, about Sarah, about all the veterans who would benefit from this. Her phone buzzed with a text. It was from Sarah. Caitlin, I wish my grandpa could see this, but I know wherever he is, he's smiling. Thank you for making sure his legacy lives on. Caitlin smiled, wiping away a tear. One small act of kindness had sparked a nationwide movement. And as she boarded her flight home, she watched as a veteran in uniform was ushered into first class. No questions asked. She didn't need recognition. She didn't need awards. This was the reward. This was the legacy. And it had all started with a single seat. A year after the launch of the Richard Dawson Seats for Service initiative, the impact was undeniable. Veterans across the country were flying in comfort, receiving the respect they had long deserved. Airlines proudly displayed signs at their gates, honoring those who served, priority upgrades for veterans and active duty military. Caitlin continued to receive messages from veterans, families, and strangers who had been touched by the movement. Some told her about emotional reunions made possible by upgraded flights. Others simply expressed their gratitude, but nothing prepared her for what happened next. One evening after a game, she received a call from an unfamiliar number. She almost ignored it, but decided to answer. Miss Clark? The voice on the other end was deep, steady, and full of authority. Yes, this is Caitlin. This is the President of the United States. I just wanted to personally thank you for what you've done for our veterans. Caitlin nearly dropped her phone. The President continued. Your act of kindness sparked something extraordinary. You've not only honored our heroes, but you've also reminded the country of the power of gratitude. I'd like to invite you to the White House to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Caitlin's breath caught in her throat. Sir, I, I'm just a basketball player. I don't know if I deserve that. You're much more than that, the president said warmly. You saw a veteran, you made a choice, and that choice changed lives. That's the kind of leadership we need more of in this world. A month later, Caitlin stood in the East Room of the White House, surrounded by some of the most influential figures in the country. Veterans, service members, and their families filled the audience, along with Sarah Dawson, who sat in the front row, tears shining in her eyes. As the president placed the medal around her neck, applause filled the room. Cameras flashed. It was surreal. When she stepped up to the podium, she looked out at the crowd and took a deep breath. I never set out to create a movement. I just saw a man who deserved better. And that's the lesson here. It doesn't take a grand gesture to change the world. In the weeks following the ceremony, Caitlin tried to settle back into her routine. The season was in full swing, and while she remained focused on the game she loved, she couldn't ignore the impact Seats for Service continued to have. Everywhere she went, veterans approached her to share their gratitude. Airports, restaurants, even courtside after games, men and women who had served in uniform thanked her, not just for the initiative, but for making them feel seen. One evening, after a close game, Caitlin sat in the locker room, scrolling through her messages. A new email caught her eye. Subject: Thank you from Afghanistan. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened it. Dear Caitlin, my name is Captain Jake Monroe. I'm currently stationed overseas, but I had to take a moment to write to you. I recently came home for my first visit in nearly 2 years. I was exhausted, emotional, and honestly, I just wanted to get home to my family as quickly as possible. When I got to my gate, I heard my name called over the speaker. They had upgraded me to first class. Because of you. That moment meant everything to me. For the first time in a long time, I felt like people truly cared about what we do. I sat there, looking out the window, realizing that someone had gone out of their way to make sure we were appreciated. You didn't have to do this, Caitlin, but you did. And I just wanted you to know. It matters. With gratitude, Captain Jake Monroe, U.S. Army. Caitlin sat back, staring at the screen, overcome with emotion. That's when she knew. This was bigger than her, bigger than basketball, bigger than she had ever imagined. That night, she made a decision. At the next press conference after a hard-fought game, a reporter asked, Caitlin, what's next for Seats for Service? Are you planning on expanding it? She smiled, gripping the microphone. Absolutely. We're working on something huge. Not just first-class upgrades, but ensuring veterans have better access to affordable flights, priority boarding, and even travel vouchers for those needing to reunite with family. The room erupted in murmurs. She continued, This isn't just about comfort on a plane. It's about making sure our heroes never feel forgotten. And trust me, we're just getting started. The headlines the next day confirmed it. Caitlin, Clark expands veteran initiative. Millions to benefit. That single moment on a plane had sparked something Caitlin never could have imagined. And as she laced up her sneakers for her next game, she knew her legacy would go far beyond basketball. Because kindness, just like a great play on the court, has a way of changing the game forever.